Welcome to CTV's Capital Dispatch with Rachel Aiello.
Hey, I'm Rachel Aiello, and here's what happened this week in Canadian politics. So, two main events unfolded on the Hill that I wanted to talk about this week. Obviously, the continued fallout from the carbon tax climb down was one of them, but also the Prime Minister's comments on the Israel-Hamas war now hitting 1 month mark. So first, let's start with what happened on Monday. The Conservatives came in with that opposition motion pushing for the government to expand the carbon pricing break on home heating oil to all forms of home heating. That came to a vote. It failed despite the NDP siding with the Conservatives. The Bloc teamed up with the Liberals and shot it down. The Bloc saying essentially this wouldn't impact Quebec. Come back to us when you've got something that would. That is because the federal price on pollution doesn't apply in Quebec. It's only in regions where either the province has asked for it or their plans don't meet the federal standard. So that prompted the first of a series of really heated question periods this week. We heard Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre go at Bloc leader Yves-François Blanchet, accusing him of joining a separatist coalition with the federal Liberals. It made for some interesting bedfellows in that the NDP were backing reluctantly, according to Jagmeet Singh, the Conservatives on this. And then it was Jagmeet Singh's turn. On Tuesday, he brought forward a motion proposing their own way to give Canadians a break on their home heating bills. He wanted the GST permanently removed. And if he was hoping to get the Conservatives backing, that support was not reciprocated. That came to a vote on Wednesday, and the only party to support the NDP in that endeavor were the Greens. So it was a bit of an interesting political pushing ahead of this conversation this week. But as this was coming out, we also heard from the federal Environment Commissioner, Jerry DeMarco, who flagged that, despite all of this rhetoric and concern over who's getting a break and who's not, the federal government's overall environmental plan is falling short of meeting their goal of reducing emissions by 2030. So that is kind of some of the facts and the policy that came into the conversation this week. But there was still a lot of politics. We've actually heard, I think this week, the most interesting breakdown in division. We had the Prime Minister, again, go hard at the Conservatives, saying that they don't have a plan so far as the Poilievre should maybe put his glasses back on to find his climate change vision. But he also went pretty hard at the NDP, saying that the NDP voting on that Conservative motion really disappointed a bunch of progressives. The NDP shot back, a bunch of progressives are really mad because you're not going to meet your targets. So there was some strain and some tension. I'll get back to that in a second. And then, of course, we had this really remarkable stop and speak from the Prime Minister midweek as the Israel-Hamas war hit the 1 month mark. He came out and acknowledged that over the last month, Canadians have been watching this war unfold on our television screens, on our social media feeds, and we've seen some of that emotion bubble up and boil over into protests, attacks. He's condemned the Islamophobia that has been seen, as well as the anti-Semitism. We've seen a number of violent incidents in the last number of weeks. The Prime Minister really driving home the fact that this is not who we are as Canadians. Canadians should remember that your neighbor, even though they might have a different view from you, is equally as scared either about themselves, their kids here in Canada, because of the hate that's on the rise, or for family members that are still in the Middle East. On that front, this was also development this week. The first batch of Canadians got out of Gaza. There was a bit of a slowdown midweek. We saw the second batch. As of recording this, around 100 Canadians have now been able to leave through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, and on the list is likely another more than 200. So there is progress being made in getting those Canadians out after weeks of being stuck there and having no clear plan. This may be helped by what we're hearing now might be some pauses in the hostilities to allow for folks to get out and aid to get in. And the Prime Minister was also really talking about how we need, he thinks, to have these pauses to be able to get to a place where meaningful work can be done to de-escalate the tensions in the region and get back to a conversation about how to find a two-state solution, a world in which Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in flourishing communities that are safe and secure. And at this point, I think those conversations seem a ways off. Pushes continue for a ceasefire. The Prime Minister faced pressure both from the NDP and the Bloc on that front this week. And then from the Conservatives, really re-upping the fact that every time the Canadian government speaks on this matter, they should start first by saying that Hamas needs to release all of the hostages immediately. So we'll continue to follow the latest on both of those files, but that's really where the dominating focus was here this week on Parliament Hill.
Just because the Liberals promise something should never be taken as it's going to happen. The reality is this is directly a result of what we forced the government to do. We put it in writing that they had to do it, and it's being done now. They voted against it in 2016. They were never going to do it unless we forced them to, and now it's happening.
So that was NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh speaking after a press conference touting this new anti-scab legislation. This was the latest example of where the NDP are saying that they really forced the government's hand to do something, and they never would have done it if they hadn't gotten into the supply and confidence deal. But are there cracks forming in the coalition? I picked this quote this week because I think what we saw transpire throughout the week on the Hill was really the most heated and contentious kind of interactions between these two parties since they got into this deal. You know, over the course of this supply and confidence arrangement, the one in which the NDP have agreed to prop up the Liberals in their minority standing until 2025 in exchange for some progress on policies that are progressive. Singh has criticized the government, but what we saw this week was, I think, really some of the more strong language, calling the Prime Minister essentially a climate delayer instead of a climate denier. And then the Prime Minister shooting right back that the NDP have disappointed progressives. And so to hear here in this conversation, or in this clip, Jagmeet Singh saying, we really can't trust the Liberals to follow through on their promises. It's only because of us that stuff is getting done. I'm just curious how long this, two-party agreement is going to last if tensions are rising. Yes, I think this anti-scab legislation, moving that forward was a nice little tick box for one of the things that had to get done this year, but pharmacare is still a TBD. There's a number of other issues outstanding in that deal. And as tensions are rising and as the polls show the Prime Minister really struggling, I'm just wondering if the NDP are testing the waters a bit on seeing when might be advantageous for them to pull out, because as Nick Nanos has flagged for our audiences before, the closer you get to an election, it's harder for you to then turn around and criticize your confidence and supply deal arrangement co-partner if you've stayed in that deal to the bitter end. But the NDP kind of pulled the plug, parachute out of it earlier, they might have a bit more ground to stand on in being a credible critic of the Liberal government. So we'll be watching that. Some murmurs this week about potentially an early election. I'll probably say that many more times before it's actually called, but the Liberals named their campaign co-chairs this week. So I think things are just a bit more elevated and backed by the pressure the Prime Minister is facing, conversations about his tenure as Prime Minister and as Liberal leader. So what am I watching for next week? Well, with Saturday being Remembrance Day, members of Parliament won't be in Ottawa. It's another constituency week next week. So Dispatch will be back in your inboxes and on your YouTube feeds a week from now. But when they come back, that's really what I'm going to be watching for, is they have 4 sitting weeks left until the end of the year. So 4 straight weeks starting November 20th. MPs are back in Ottawa and they have a long list of legislation to get through. And the way that tensions have been, it's likely going to be an even more acrimonious 4 weeks as the pressure's really on to pass bills. But the one main thing I am watching for that week when they come back, November 21st, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland is going to be presenting her fall economic update. This is essentially, people call it a mini budget. I don't love that term. But an economic checkup. So a revised look at the books from the last federal budget, which was in the spring. So this is coming at a time where the economy seems to be slowing down. The Bank of Canada is warning that fiscal and monetary policy are kind of operating at odds. And the Conservatives obviously keeping up their pressure on the government spending. So we've been hearing from Freeland this conversation around restraint. We've been hearing from Anand, the Treasury Board Secretary, talking about the need to save money. She's on this $15 billion savings reallocation plan. So I'll be watching to see what actually is in this. I don't think this is going to be a fall economic update that offers a lot of goodies for Canadians. It's also going to provide us a clearer picture on where the deficit is, where the government sees the overall economic trajectory. Freeland's framing it at least as an affordability and housing focused package. But as we've been seeing pretty much every week since they came back in the fall, their little tidbits of announcements on affordability are quite piecemeal and small. And so is it going to be more of that, or are we going to finally see some bigger announcement that will impact more Canadians? Stay tuned.